I think that capitalism has given us incredible technology, art, science, medicine. But there's this new form of capitalism that I call predatory capitalism. That's the enemy of true capitalism. Let me explain.
In 1975, during the Church Committee, there were numerous revelations about the practices that the CIA employed to eliminate leaders around the world. These methods were employed everywhere, and nowhere more violently than in Africa and parts of South America. The CIA has been shown to be behind the assassination or ouster of Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Marcus Garvey, Muammar Gaddafi, Kwame Nkrumah, Laurent Gbagbo, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and so many more. But the reason they did it will shock you.
The organization constitutes an attempt to replace the old system of colonial exploitation by a new system of collective colonialism, which will be stronger and more dangerous than the old evils we are striving to liquidate from our continent.
A decade later, coming out of the independence movement, when one of the most enduring voices of the Black and African movement spoke the following words, his prophetic verb exposed the true source of evil that bound the wrists of a whole planet. He said, and I quote, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." These words would ultimately get him assassinated a year later. But what he didn't realize is that behavior he called out, defense spending, wasn't just Orwellian in its name, but that after analysis, the system, because of its very nature, had no option but to revert to violence, and that Black people everywhere were the unfortunate historical target. The perfect target. A target that had the exact elixir that the short-sighted, abominable demon needed to survive. A seven-headed beast that has devoured all of our heroes in its gluttony for money over people. A beast with fancy names like IMF, WTO, World Bank, UN, European Parliament, NATO, G7, that brandishes the flag of progress as a justification for all its atrocities. And yet, when taken into full view it, in effect, slows down the whole planetary progress. And that beast is capitalism. Not the true free market capitalism, but the bastardized version of it that is upheld by the West. Often sold in a package with democracy and labeled as free market enterprise, capitalism has been pushed on as a model of choice for development for the world. Within countries that have adopted this model, capitalism has massively concentrated power to a very few and, in the same process, created massive amounts of corruption that has stifled development after an initial burst of success. Those who own the capital and the corporations that run them use that power to, number one, keep power, and number two, erode the very fabric of democracy and thus the power of the free market system. Why? It's because in order to maintain an organism that is no longer competitive in a free market system, the organism has no choice but to transform itself or rig the game. It has to transform the rules to its advantage. And that is one of the main reasons why our code of laws has become so complex, riddled with loopholes and special interests. In great majority, these laws are there to prevent competition or force the consumer or its tax contribution into an arrangement that the people themselves do not want, from lobbyists to corrupt officials. And so, the organism survives through laws and politicians it paid for and is not replaced by a better one, at least one that is better for the people. This is not because capitalism isn't good. It is because the brand of capitalism that we have in the West, and there are many versions of capitalism, the one we use in the West has been allowed to operate under a model where the corporation has become more important than people. This is why globalism can be seen as the extension of capitalism to the whole world, and why its results mirror the results of what happens within one country, meaning that rich countries are the capital holders, and all other countries are its employees, its workforce. So the poorer countries become subservient to the interests of the rich ones, and over time, in order to maintain that order, illogical rules are forced onto and maintained onto the resource-rich countries, and these rules are not designed to help the people and develop a fair trade, a global free market, but instead, they are there to erode the wealth and freedom of most people for the benefit of a few countries. We are then sold an excuse of lack of industrialization as an explanation for the deplorable state of the poor countries, as if African countries are incapable of thinking about and wanting to industrialize. Funny enough, history shows Africa has always wanted and tried to industrialize, but, as we shall see, even the thought of it was met with such a level of violence that Joe Perkins titled his book after those who carry out these atrocities and destabilize. Perkins called it an economic hitman, or if it is not industrialization, it is corruption that is brought forth as a reason, all the while overlooking that the Western countries are extremely corrupt, so much so that it is institutionalized, and for decades that corruption has also been imposed onto the poorer countries, where efforts to clean up the political class are met with the same fate. So when a poor country realizes this and tries to free itself from this model of servitude, where its natural resources and its workforce are not benefiting its own people, those who control capital intervene, just as they do within a country. But this time they do it on an international stage. This is simply because those at the top of the system are dependent on the output of the poor countries, and they will use any means to keep that status quo, from forcing corruption models of operations to eliminating any ideas of divergence, and that includes the assassination of these leaders. They bend the rules to make the uncompetitive corporation and country survive, at the cost of the African individual's freedom, but also at the cost or planetary-wide progress and well-being. But this does not mean that the narrative of the rich countries are true. It is merely an excuse to exercise force so that they can maintain power. And it comes in many forms: economic disfavoritism, where mainstream Americans receive funding at the end of the war that enables them to buy property while their black counterparts are denied the same advantages, let alone the right to purchase land. It also comes in the form of class divide, where race is used as an easy cop-out, where fake scientific models and indicators are used to label the black man as less than his brethrens. It further appears as historical theft, where black history is denied or reattributed to people who did not build our past. And finally, it shows up as the savior complex, where the current holders of power pretend that they have a duty to, quote, help the poor countries, end quote, which usually means military intervention that usually result in the country of the black nation being far worse of. All of these actions only make sense when looked at from the standpoint of an organism that depends on black nations in order to survive. In fact, a different model is used for Arabic majority countries because the West is dependent on their oil. In this instance, it is their oil that the West is after, and the label used to justify the use of force is that they are terrorists. It is in part why Nelson Mandela had such a liking to Yasser Arafat, because he recognized that the fight for freedom of the black man is the same fight that those living in the Middle East were facing, in that in an effort to maintain a planetary imbalance of power of monumental scale, they had to remove the humanity of a whole group in order to enact an agenda of control that feeds the beast with its 7 heads. A beast masquerading as a salesman of free market, but that only spits out less freedom for all. And we will start with the young man from Central Africa, who wanted to use the natural resources of the 11th largest country in the world. A young man well ahead of his time, but who stood up against a mighty colonial power, freed his people, if only for a little while. I would like to take a few moments to remind you all that Without History does not take any sponsors precisely because we want to remain an independent voice which speak for out true history. It is through your donations and memberships on Patreon and YouTube that we are able to do what we do. You can find the support links in the video description. Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, stood as a beacon of Pan-African unity and economic independence. His vision centered on harnessing Congo's vast mineral wealth for the benefit of its citizens rather than foreign corporations. Lumumba called for national unity and rejected neo-colonial interference. The Congo emerged from brutal Belgian colonial rule, marked by systemic exploitation and impoverishment of the native population. Despite its vast mineral resources, the majority of Congolese lived in dire poverty. Infrastructure was minimal, and access to education and political representation was virtually non-existent. Lumumba started as a revolutionary by writing his thoughts in newspapers and quickly gained a strong voice with the support of the people. In 1958, the same year that he launched his party, the MNC, Lumumba went to Ghana where he delivered one of his memorable speeches. There, he impressed the whole Africa with his Pan-African vision, his leadership and brightness. The Belgians, noticing that there was a strong anti-colonialism movement rising up in Africa, tried to front-end the movement by staging elections, which they announced in 1959. Unfortunately for them, Lumumba read through the charade and boycotted the elections. This culminated into riots in 1960, which were highly suppressed by the Belgian authorities. Belgium-led security forces fired indiscriminately in the crowds. 30 Congolese were reported killed in Kisangani, but in reality, the number would have been much higher. Lumumba was immediately arrested by the Belgian government on charges of inciting violence. That is when the MNC party decided to join the elections, where it won 90% of the votes. After winning, they immediately demanded the release of Lumumba, who became Congo's first prime minister. His inauguration speech, till this day, stands as one of the benchmarks of anti-imperialism, but more importantly of a true African vision. And he delivered this speech, with the Belgian leaders and the Belgian king in attendance. He defiantly declared, "We have experienced forced labor in exchange for pay that did not allow us to satisfy our hunger, to clothe ourselves, to have decent lodgings, or to bring up our children as dearly loved ones. Morning, noon, and night, we were subjected to jeers, insults, and blows, because we were Negroes." This shocked the Belgian king in attendance, who miscalculated and was expecting a speech of servitude. But Lumumba had written his speech in secret, and he was even photographed finalizing his speech, while the King of Belgium delivered his tone-deaf remarks. But it is when he spoke the following word that the West decided to oust him. "We shall show the world what the black man can do when working in liberty, and we shall make the Congo the pride of Africa. We shall see to it that the lands of our native country truly benefit its children." End quote. And yet what could be more natural than to use the natural resources of your land to better the condition of your own people? Lumumba did not advocate for the African to steal resources from America. He did not advocate to starve Europe by suspending export of grain. He did not ask that 5% of the Belgian population get their right hand cut off because they didn't want to work for the Congolese people. No, all he asked for was for self-determination. The same self-determination that Martin Luther King and Kwame Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey, and Malcolm X were advocating for. These words sent a signal to the world that Africa had arrived and was ready to take their determination into their own hands. And instead of looking for ways to partner with Africa and the Congo, the West used its colonial intelligence agency to torture and eliminate Lumumba. The cover story used by American state officials was that Lumumba was turning to the Russians for military aid, and so this could not be allowed. This is where you must ask yourself, when was the last time you got your leg cut off because you wanted to buy some soup instead of a hamburger?
In January of 1961, over 50 years ago, Lumumba, who was a prisoner of CIA-financed Congolese leaders who had replaced him after a coup, he was transferred by them to a Belgian-backed so-called independent province of Katanga, which had most of the wealth of the Congo. He was then tortured and murdered by the Katangese and their white officers, Belgian officers.
The real reason why the CIA got involved in an affair involving the Belgium and Congolese is because U.S. economic and strategic interests were heavily reliant on minerals from the Congo, and it comes in multiple forms.
People up to now, haven't focused very much on the CIA role, partly because the Church Committee, a committee of the United States Senate, investigated this and determined, and this is the quote, Lumumba was killed by Congolese rivals. It does not appear from the evidence that the United States was in any way involved with the killing. But this is a mistake.
The Congo's Shinkolobwe mine in Katanga province was a critical source of uranium for the United States. During World War II and the early Cold War, uranium from this mine supplied the Manhattan Project, leading to the development of the first atomic bombs. By 1959, uranium remained vital for the U.S. nuclear arsenal and its civilian nuclear energy programs. The Congo's high-grade uranium ore was among the richest in the world and indispensable for the U.S. military-industrial complex. Cobalt, another resource abundant in the Congo, was essential for the production of jet engines, high-strength alloys, and rechargeable batteries. The U.S. viewed cobalt as a critical material for its defense and aerospace sectors. The Congo was one of the world's largest producers of cobalt, making it a key supplier to the U.S. during the Cold War. Copper from the Congo was vital for electrical wiring, infrastructure development, and manufacturing in the U.S. The Congo was among the leading global producers of copper, and its exports helped meet the high demand in the growing U.S. economy. The Congo was a major source of industrial diamonds, used in drilling, cutting, and grinding applications. Industrial diamonds were critical for the U.S. automotive and construction industries, as well as for defense purposes, and the list goes on. But instead of working with the new Congolese leadership and forging new economic partnership that would ensure mutual growth, the U.S. decided to maintain exploitation of tens of millions of people and cause the death of hundreds of thousands in Congo alone. And this wasn't new. Within its own borders, the U.S. had exterminated the black community of Tulsa, Oklahoma, because somehow the success of black people is seen as a threat to mainstream American society. And so, Lumumba, in their eyes, had to be killed. A sacrifice that would keep the seven-headed beast alive. A monster who, instead of innovating around its dependencies, decides to reduce a whole region to poverty, malnutrition, disease, and death for 60 years and counting. A beast who, instead of finding allies with whom to grow, thrives by draining the life of the Africans and its descendants. And it masks its deeds by trying to claim that the black man and the black woman are not worthy of civilization, let alone progress.
Many people were killed in the Lumumbist rebellions in 1964 to 1967, but some people number it in the hundreds of thousands.
After Lumumba's death, the country fell into civil unrest, where countless Africans died. The irony of irony is that following the assassination of Lumumba, Western powers put in place and maintained Mobutu Sese Seko, a brutal dictator who essentially bankrupted the Congo. All this under the watchful eye and support of those who claim to have the mandate of spreading democracy in the world. Lumumba wasn't the only African leader of a resource-rich country that was calling for African unification and that wanted to use its natural resources to better its people.
So, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed reports.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.
48 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest in Africa, free healthcare, free education, highest GDP per capita in Africa.
Gaddafi. What at first appears to be a spontaneous uprising is in reality the culmination of a carefully managed, top-secret, 30-year-old CIA operation.
Greatest man-made river in the world that was bringing fresh water to 70% of all Libyans, all of it self-funded. That was the Libya of Gaddafi.
What few people know as the rebellion against Gaddafi unfolds is that the man leading the uprising is in fact a long-time CIA contact.
Not as the West portrayed him, not a mindless brute dictator, but a visionary. He called for Africa to have its own currency backed by gold, a single currency for the whole continent. If we think about it, this would have made Africa one of the foremost economic blocs in the world, overnight. This was the move that caused the West to assassinate him, a coalition of US and European countries. This proposal to move to a single currency was, and still is, overwhelmingly supported by all Africans. The continent has over 40% of world gold reserves and a gargantuan amount of unmined gold. A gold-backed currency would eliminate reliance on Western financial systems like the IMF or World Bank, reducing external debt. Currently, Africa owes over $700 billion in external debt, often tied to fluctuating foreign currencies. With a single currency, Africa's combined GDP, currently around $3 trillion, and population of 1.4 billion, would form a vast, interconnected market. This would rival economic blocs like the EU and strengthen Africa's negotiating power in global trade. But above all, by eliminating reliance on foreign financial systems like the IMF or World Bank, a strong, stable currency would enable Africa to finance its industrial projects without begging foreign interests or getting interest-crippling loans with conditions that are designed to keep Africa poor. In 1969, under the monarchy of King Idris, Libya, despite its newly discovered oil reserves, was largely under the influence of Western oil companies. Profits were siphoned off to foreign entities, while many Libyans lived in poverty or lacked adequate infrastructure. Education, healthcare, and basic services were scarce, and political participation for the average citizen was minimal. When Gaddafi and his fellow young officers orchestrated the bloodless coup in 1969, they justified their action as liberating Libya from the grip of foreign powers. Gaddafi quickly consolidated power, declaring Libya a Jamahiriya, or a state of the masses, intending to put the nation's vast oil wealth to work for ordinary citizens. Through various social programs, he channeled resources into free healthcare, free education, housing subsidies, and other benefits that significantly raised the Libyan standard of living, making the country one of Africa's most prosperous at the time. In the 1970s, Gaddafi began laying out his broader ideological vision in his famous Green Book, advocating for direct popular governance, economic socialism, and Arab-African solidarity. He also saw the potential for Libya's oil wealth to be used in support of African liberation movements, lending financial and diplomatic backing to anti-colonial struggles across the continent. His stance put him at odds with Western governments, who saw his influence as a threat to their strategic and economic interests. This is where we must remember that true capitalist interests are not threatened by competition. On the contrary, it thrives on it. Because competition causes what causes the quality of goods to increase, causes innovation to bring new services and goods, and prices to decrease. But in a predatory capitalist system, corruption is used to avoid competition, and aggression is also used. You will recognize its symptoms in illogical slogans of foreign wars to defend the country, and where young men are sent to defend the interest of a non-competitive corporation. By the 1990s and early 2000s, Gaddafi's vision for a United States of Africa grew bolder. He proposed an African central bank, an African army, and a single currency for the entire continent. The idea of an African gold-backed currency, in particular, alarmed Western powers, who feared losing control over a financial system deeply rooted in the US dollar. Much like Patrice Lumumba decades earlier, Gaddafi believed that African resources, from oil to precious metals, should first and foremost be used to uplift the people of Africa. As a founding force behind the African Union, AU, Gaddafi urged fellow heads of state to create institutions that could defend African sovereignty. His push often clashed with Western interests that relied on Africa as a steady source of vital minerals and fossil fuels. Though Gaddafi's methods and rhetoric were questioned by many, the core of his argument resonated with other African leaders. Africa's wealth in African hands for African development. Put in this context, it is easy to understand why the hand of the Western capitalist system tried multiple times to eliminate Gaddafi. The US and allied countries reportedly supported covert operations to eliminate Gaddafi, particularly during the 1980s. One notable example was the 1986 bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi, Operation El Dorado Canyon, following allegations of Libyan involvement in terrorism. While not explicitly an assassination attempt, it targeted Gaddafi's compound, narrowly missing him but killing several others, including his adopted daughter. Various Libyan factions, often funded by Western powers, plotted against him. Some were suppressed before execution due to Gaddafi's pervasive intelligence network. Well before the 2011 civil war that destroyed Libya, Western leaders were already talking about removing Gaddafi. And this came right after Gaddafi started to push for a single African currency. And for this, they used the whole might of the colonial capitalist machine, even though Gaddafi was making serious efforts to open up to the international community. Case in point? Well, the very person that plotted to get him killed received untold millions from Gaddafi to get him elected.
Well, on the very day that Muammar Gaddafi was killed, then French President Nicolas Sarkozy said that his death would mark the start of a new democratic process in Libya. But just months prior to that, Sarkozy had allegedly accepted illegal campaign money from the late Libyan dictator, and this in order to finance his 2007 presidential run. And it was no small sum. It said that he obtained some 50 million euros from Gaddafi, and this in exchange for a pledge to help the Libyan leader rehabilitate his international image.
Multiple reports allege collaboration between international intelligence agencies like Mossad, MI6, and Libyan opposition to plan his assassination, though many of these plots failed or were unsubstantiated. Yet international tensions followed him throughout his rule. In the 1980s, the United States imposed sanctions on Libya, accusing Gaddafi of sponsoring terrorism. NATO's repeated confrontations with Libya further exacerbated hostilities, culminating in the 2011 intervention during the Arab Spring uprisings. Western media justified the campaign by portraying Gaddafi as a brutal dictator suppressing his own people. In reality, the conflict was also a struggle over the redistribution of Libya's oil wealth and Gaddafi's calls for an Africa less dependent on Western corporations and financial systems. WikiLeaks released a trove of emails from Hillary Clinton's private server during her tenure as U.S. Secretary of State, shedding light on the 2011 Libyan intervention. These emails reveal that Clinton was a pivotal advocate for U.S. involvement in Libya, aiming to support the NATO-led mission to protect civilians during the civil war. In correspondence with her advisor, Sidney Blumenthal, discussions highlighted France's interests in Libya, including access to oil and concerns over Gaddafi's gold reserves, potentially undermining the French franc in Africa. Multiple reports allege collaboration between international intelligence agencies like Mossad, MI6, and Libyan opposition to plan his assassination, though many of these plots failed or were unsubstantiated. Yet international tensions followed him throughout his rule. In the 1980s, the United States imposed sanctions on Libya, accusing Gaddafi of sponsoring terrorism. NATO's repeated confrontations with Libya further exacerbated hostilities, culminating in the 2011 intervention during the Arab Spring uprisings. Western media justified the campaign by portraying Gaddafi as a brutal dictator suppressing his own people. In reality, the conflict was also a struggle over the redistribution of Libya's oil wealth and Gaddafi's calls for an Africa less dependent on Western corporations and financial systems. WikiLeaks released a trove of emails from Hillary Clinton's private server during her tenure as U.S. Secretary of State, shedding light on the 2011 Libyan intervention. These emails reveal that Clinton was a pivotal advocate for U.S. involvement in Libya, aiming to support the NATO-led mission to protect civilians during the civil war. In correspondence with her advisor, Sidney Blumenthal, discussions highlighted France's interests in Libya, including access to oil and concerns over Gaddafi's gold reserves, potentially undermining the French franc in Africa. One notable email from March 2011 details French President Nicolas Sarkozy's motivations, citing a desire for increased access to Libyan oil and a strategic move to assert French military power. Clinton's active role in the intervention is further evidenced by her efforts in coalition building and diplomatic negotiations, as seen in various communications throughout the conflict. Gaddafi's capture and killing in October 2011 marked the end of his 4-decade rule. In the aftermath, Libya descended into chaos, with rival factions vying for power, leading to a humanitarian and political crisis still unresolved. Once one of Africa's wealthiest nations, post-Gaddafi Libya became plagued by insecurity, human trafficking, and internal conflicts. I hope by now you see the pattern. Africans want to help their people, but the West, who touts a free market approach to world economy, has in fact undermined it. This pattern of behavior goes back centuries, and wherever it could, the seven-headed beast exerted its lack of humanity by completely destroying successful Black and African countries and communities if it meant getting a few more dollars. In many ways, we owe our modern independence movement to a small island who stood against the beast, freed its people, and because of who they were, they are still paying the price till this day. Their independence movement was started by a very unlikely figure, a military genius who applied his skills to change history.
There's one great New World rebel many have forgotten. He was a nobody who became a somebody only after 50 years of obscurity, who wound up leading the only successful large-scale slave revolt in history, the general who made Haiti the second free colony in the whole of the Americas. His name was Toussaint Louverture, aka the Black Napoleon. Kept on rising until he became ruler of the society that had enslaved him, an enlightened thinker, a prescient philosopher, and a brilliant general. Louverture was also a man who dared to dream of freedom even if he wouldn't live.
When he defeated France, the United States, and Spain to free Haiti, Toussaint Louverture did so after spending his life learning how to read and write under an oppressive French colonial regime. He proved himself to be a shrewd military strategist. He managed to organize the Haitian revolt into a well-coordinated and disciplined force, which triumphed over better-equipped colonial armies. His dream was for the Haitian people to be free and to have the opportunity for their labor to profit their own communities. However, because they had lost control of the island, the French and Americans burned down the lucrative plantations to prevent the Haitians from benefiting. They also imposed an embargo on the island. If anything qualifies as a crime against humanity, it is the embargo of an island nation. Continuing this policy to the present day has resulted in countless lost lives among Haiti's Black population. These casualties are not as publicized as those in other global conflicts, but one must wonder why every effort Haiti makes to flourish economically has been thwarted by the West. I can already hear the argument of those who have bought into the narrative that Haiti is poor because their people are incapable of being economically successful. To them, I will share the following. The United States occupied Haiti from 1915 to 1934, officially citing concerns over political instability and foreign influence, but the primary motivations were to protect U.S. economic interests and assert dominance in the Caribbean. During the occupation, the U.S. implemented exploitative policies that disrupted Haitian society and economy. One such policy was the corvée system, which used forced labor to build infrastructure like roads, not for the benefit of Haitians, but to facilitate U.S. economic and military control. Additionally, land redistribution policies allowed wealthy U.S. and Haitian elites to acquire vast tracts of land, displacing small-scale farmers who had relied on subsistence agriculture to survive. We see here again the hand of the Western-style capitalist, robbing the industry of the people for the profit-making of those who do not care about the society itself and its progress. Haiti was once largely self-sufficient in rice production, a key staple in its diet, until U.S. policies and multinational interests deliberately undermined its agricultural sector in the 1980s and 1990s. Under pressure from the IMF and World Bank, Haiti was forced to adopt structural adjustment programs, SAPs, that required slashing tariffs on imports, including rice, from 35% to just 3%. This opened the Haitian market to heavily subsidized U.S. rice, known locally as Miami rice, which was sold at prices so low that local farmers could not compete. Multinational agribusinesses in the U.S., such as Cargill, profited enormously from this arrangement, while Haitian agriculture collapsed, leaving rural farmers impoverished and unable to sustain their livelihoods. What Black and African nations need are true free market systems, supported by governance structures that enable self-determination and growth. This is why we are witnessing a new wave of independence movements in Africa, with leaders like Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso and Assimi Goïta of Mali, expelling French interests and rapidly transforming their nations. These leaders have shifted their countries from dependency to becoming some of the fastest-growing economies in Africa and among the fastest in the world. This represents a true realization of the dream envisioned by Malcolm X and Thomas Sankara, where the nations of Amun and Ra can once again thrive. It is an opportunity to break free from the legacy of setbacks, such as the drying up of the Sahara, a tragedy that led to the collapse of African civilizations and forced its people to start over within the continent. If you like this type of videos, please let me know in the comment. I want to give a huge shout out to all my supporters, from those who click the like button, to those who leave a comment, share and join our membership. You are all doing your part in sharing the knowledge of our true history. For those looking for some content that I cannot post on YouTube, please join us on Twitter, X. And don't miss our episodes on the Phoenicians, the Olmecs, the African influence in ancient Asia, and the birth of mathematics. Join us and see how those who are said to be without history birthed civilization itself.